All right, everyone. Good morning. I do apologize if I look kind of weird on the screen. I'm using my cell phone to talk to you today because my computer would not connect to the meeting. I don't know why. Um, Good morning. Thank you all for being on here today. I just forwarded you the presentation for today that Mr. Ritter has provided to us. Just for context, today is RDS Basics. I know a lot of you on here. Some of you may receive information you've already seen. A lot of this is a lot really for the new people, but I know that there are nuggets of information that even the seasoned admissions and residence liaison people may get out of this. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Mr. Ritter.
Okay, thanks, Monty. So you've put it up on the screen. Am I going to be able to, or do you want me to share mine?
You may need to share yours.
Yeah, let's do that if we could, please. Yeah.
And I can see yours. If you have it up, I can see it, which means that everyone else can probably see it too.
Yeah, let me see. I may have the wrong thing on there. Hold on.
Okay. There you go. We can see it.
Hey, Jane, I think you're muted.
Oh, Gene, you're talking. You're muted if you are. Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. Is that better?
Yes, but yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay. All right. So good morning. Hope falls off to a good start for you all. For some of you, this is going to be a review. I am going to get into some new changes at the end of this, but we also have new staff. So what we've found is at least once a year to have kind of this first session kind of give an overview of what's going on, especially for our new folks trying to understand the big picture here. And then we have a second session scheduled next month that gets into more advanced issues, especially the staff that are responsible for like entering and coding tuition exceptions or things handled at the campus level or certain students that need tracking. So we'll go into, I'll give an overview of that very quickly today, but we'll go into more detail about those things, campus responsibilities in the next session. But I've really allowed a lot of time here to have a discussion or answer questions, hear any concerns as we go through. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly just to give you some overview of the basics. We'll cover the changes, some things we're seeing at this end. We periodically do reevaluations and make some adjustments, but then have plenty of time for discussion. As I say, you all will be receiving a copy of these slides, so don't worry about trying to write things down if this is new to you. Okay. So again, we're going to do kind of a quick overview. It's important to always refocus on, like, there's 3 or 4 basic legal requirements that, when a student isn't passing, what's involved there. There's a number of special, students say, well, I have a special circumstance. There are numerous ones. I'm just going to give you a list that we screen for that, there are provisions in law. I want to give you an overview of what the student experiences, what they see, what they can do to get back in and check status or resources for them. We're going to highlight just what are the roles of the campuses and certain things about pulling them in, monitoring certain things. Then I'm going to talk about updates, and I'll give a quick overview about the types of campus-based tuition exceptions that may exist for your students. They all have specific requirements, but there are some out there, particularly for the community college system. So there's a lot of myths about this, that RDS kind of made up all these rules. State law dates back to the 1970s about tuition, residency for tuition purposes, and those laws have essentially not changed. What has changed is they have carved in more and more provisions about you might get an exception or for certain special circumstances. It's honestly, in some ways, a little stricter, but not that different from other states. Every state has some criteria about who gets in-state tuition versus paying out of state. So RDS just simply centralizes that process, and we try to automate as much as possible by checking things electronically. Back in the day, the students had to submit a lot of hard copy documents, and that raises a lot of questions also about information security and things like that. But basically, your system, you don't have the ability at your end to ever change a residency determination. You might be able to change a tuition exception, and that's an important difference that has implications for grants we're going to talk about. But currently, and I did an evaluation last year in October during the college application season for high school students. On the initial consideration, only about 5% of students are asked for documents, and there are situations we cannot validate electronically when they say, okay, custody was taken from my parents, I'm awarded the state, or it was awarded to someone else, I have a court-appointed legal guardian, or I'm a non-citizen, I have an eligible immigration status, we need to see a document, cases like that. But otherwise, most things happen electronically. So again, there's an important distinction between, you'll see in RDS referred to like they got in, or out, or there's an out in. The first is, do you meet the regular residency criteria? If not, there might be a tuition exception, but it doesn't change your residency. And that's important because separate laws govern state grants, and those exceptions do not make you eligible for a state grant. You have to fully meet the residency criteria. Okay. So that's why we got to make an important distinction between the two. But in effect, for most of your students, you can give a tuition exception if necessary, if they don't meet the criteria. Some of them have very strict time limits, and we'll give a few of them later, but important distinction there. You may be able to change a given tuition, but it won't qualify the first state grant. So basically, in a nutshell, immigration or RDS law gets pretty complicated because of all the exceptions that have been carved in, trying to give students some opportunity to pay in state tuition. But the basic legal requirements are fairly straightforward. The person has to have the legal capacity to establish a permanent residence. We'll get students in high school saying, I'm 17, I'll be 18 in the summer, and I don't want to use my parents. Well, legally, they don't have the ability to establish a separate permanent residence. They're attached legal to the parent in most cases. And then once they turn 18, the age of majority, they can begin to establish one if it's, if the parents are a different state. For non-citizens, they have to hold an immigration status that doesn't prohibit them from establishing a residence. You can have certain visa types that you're not allowed to do that. It's only a temporary condition. So as long as the visa type doesn't say no, we accept it. Domicile means it has to be your primary home. You'd be surprised how many people we get that they live out of state and their son or daughter wants to come to North Carolina to go to school, and they're trying to use a secondary home or vacation home or a friend's home or something. If there's more than one home in the picture, the law says only one could be your domicile or primary residence. And then we have to figure out which one is. And then duration, once you establish it, you have to hold it and be here 12 months. So the person who moves here, tomorrow isn't going to be eligible the day after. You have to establish it and hold it. That's pretty similar just about every state. Importantly, the law specifically says that the domicile of the parent is going to be presumed, if there's a living parent or guardian, to be where they're domiciled. They don't have to be living with them. Until the student can show they're independent, including financial. One of the biggest sources of our appeals every year are students who came here from out of state to go to a university, and to their mind, I've been here 12 months, so now I'm in state. Well, you're going to have to show that you are independent, that dorm doesn't count as a permanent residence, but you have an apartment, you have a job, whatever, but that you have financial independence. Most of them, the parents are sending them checks and sending checks to school. They're not financially independent. So merely being here is not sufficient. But We do look at that, and we can count certain types of financial aid toward independence. So as long as it's not just like a co-signed loan of the parent. But that's the presumption in law until they can show that they can meet most of their expenses on their own merit. They can get some financial aid, but it can't be the majority. So those are the basic concepts in law to meet the full residency requirement. As I said, there's a lot of special provision carved in the law. I'm not going to go each one of these, but in terms of, okay, in this situation, here's how we can treat it. I mentioned about immigration status, we screen to make sure it's eligible. If they're a ward of the state, they're in foster care, okay, and they are currently or were when they turned 18, we will just say, okay, that's it. We're not looking for a parent. We'll consider them independent. They've been here in North Carolina, fine. So there's a provision if someone was orphaned. It's not unusual if someone was orphaned age 16, 17, and a family member takes them in, they don't go to court to have a legal guardian appointed. So there's provisions for all this, or split family, one parents in one state, one in another, and so forth. So RDS screens for all of this. So when they tell you, well, I have special circumstances, tell RDS what it is, and if there's a way to qualify, we're going to work with you. I'm going to come back and talk about the military in a little more detail about who can qualify there for special provisions. But there are a lot of, and this is just a quick overview. I mean, a lot of them get really complex, but RDS screens for all this for the students. We really try our best to find a way to qualify the student if they're truly, eligible. I mentioned immigration status. There's two types. It's either permanent or temporary. If it's permanent, like your green card holders, that is the permanent lawful residents, even if their card expires, they used to issue them for life, and some people still have those old cards. The cards, they're just trying to force them to get new ones to combat fraud, fraudulent documents by having them, come back every so many years, but the status never expires. So when we see one like that and we verify it, we flick a flag in the system that if the student ever comes back again, we're never going to ask for that document again. There's no need because it's permanent. Once we validate it's permanent. Temporary is a different matter. Some visa types, I mean, they can be here as long as, for example, an employer renews it, they can be here 20, 30 years and establish a residence. But there's also some restrictions where some students, and this is going to come up in our next session about tracking a few of these students that have time-limited visas, that a lot of them, if they got it through a parent, will age out and they will lose their immigration status. So they're unless they can qualify for another one on their own merit. So we distinguish between those. If a student doesn't hold one, we don't sit there and put in the record anything about, well, they're undocumented. I hate that term because there are many, even U.S. immigration uses that inconsistently to my mind. But a DACA status or whatever, you don't have an eligible status. You may have a visa that's active, but the government says you may not establish a residence. You're here temporarily. So we just say there's no evidence. Now, maybe they have it, but they just didn't submit the document in time. We just say the student didn't present evidence. So RDS screens for all of that. So if the student tells us that, they give us the information, we review it. We can look up in immigration databases some detail if we need to. Okay, so RDS takes care of all of that for you. I want to talk about active duty military exception. Some exceptions have to be handled at the campus because they require other ongoing things to track, such as, like in veterans, it's different because it has to be tied to an award. If they use up the award, they lose the exception. So this one is kind of a blanket, that if a family of a service member is not claiming North Carolina as their permanent residence, if they are and they just happen to be away in assignment, they're fine. The family members are fine. But if they're claiming another state, they're not going to be eligible in North Carolina unless the service member is stationed here. Okay. They don't have to use any kind of benefit. It's not time limited as long as they're stationed here. And once the student enrolls, they can keep it. So RDS can go ahead and screen that for you and get the paperwork. So in a nutshell, I kind of summarized it that If their permanent duty is stationed here, but they claim another state, they may be eligible for this. If they meet the criteria for residency, we tell them in the interview, go ahead and do that because that could open a state grant for them, for example, where the exception would not. So they would, if they're the non-resident, they would get that out-in determination you would see. They're an out-of-state resident, but they're eligible for in-state tuition that RDS would assign. Spouses and dependents can benefit from it as long as they're here accompanying the service member. So, and they can generally keep it as long as they're continuously enrolled in the program. Even if the service member gets transferred, they will allow them to finish the program. Again, they don't have to use a benefit. In terms of National Guard or other reservists, there's a provision for members of the North Carolina National Guard, but not any other drilling reservist type, like so Army Reserve, Navy, and so forth in North Carolina. These are folks that live in the community. There is, however, a provision for National Guard. We rarely give this exception because in practice, almost all of them have been here and they are North Carolina residents. But there are some, for example, who live in South Carolina and Virginia, some in South Carolina across from Charlotte, where they affiliate. There's a large Air National Guard unit in Charlotte. So as long as they have a contract with North Carolina National Guard, even though they're living in South Carolina, they could get that out in exception. Okay. Reservists, there's no special provision, but there is in law for the North Carolina. Again, these are all things that RDS screens for. You probably won't see many of these. I think since we went live and now we're almost up to 2.5 million students, I've only seen like 25 or something like that. So you probably won't see many, but again, we would screen for that. So that's it in a nutshell about the active duty. So these are people who are claiming another state, but they're here on service. There's no provision if they don't. We've had questions recently about the service member claims, and we honor whatever they have on file with the military, and the form they fill out certifying it even cautions them about there's implications, including for in-state tuition. So choose wisely. So if they claim another state and they're not stationed here, but a family member wants to be here at school, that they wouldn't be eligible. They'd have to meet regular criteria at some point. So back to the determinations in general, it's online, it's sophisticated if you're not familiar with it. It uses a process kind of like a tax prep program, uses a lot of skip logic and smart logic of, first question is, are you claiming residency? We have people who live out of the state, they want to come here to a 4-year, they know they're not a resident, they say no, they're done, they have their number, you move on, they can always come back. Or they otherwise know they're not going to meet requirements. But one of the first questions it asks about is their military involvement in the family, and then it asks them that. So, then questions, are you a citizen or not? If not, it takes you to immigration questions. If you're military, it takes you to military questions. If not, it skips all of that. So students are never going to see the same screens in the same order. 99% of the students receive a provisional decision right away, subject to validation. UNCs won't pull that in. They are not interested until it's validated, but we know the culture of community colleges of folks showing up first day of classes wanting to apply for admission, register, get their financial aid and whatnot. This gives a chance to get a provisional determination. We tell them it's subject to validation. If the information does not validate, the student gets notified, usually next business day in an email. They can come back, but it would be if the state agency is saying, nope, we don't find any record of that person. Students can always log. I get this question a lot about the students. A student comes into college and they say, oh, I don't know my status, or I don't know what's going on, or I don't know if I owe a document, or I don't know why I got out of state. Students, this is what they see when they log back into their account. There's always a dashboard. I know this is small, you can't see details, but it tells you, like this one, there's an example of someone who just submitted. It looks like you're a resident. It looks like you're eligible, but it hasn't been validated yet. Okay. If they owe a document, there'll be another box that says, have we received your document? It would say no. And what you see there in blue text turns red and says, we are still waiting for the copy of military orders showing assignment here, or we're still waiting for your immigration document. There's also the option, if they disagree, we're going to get to this, of wanting to do a reconsideration appeal to challenge that. So they can always see this and log in and see their status. Also, not on this page, but when they're going through the interview, pretty much on every page of questions, there's contact information. They can call the call center if they have questions about it, you know. Okay, so what we use to determine, and this is important, effective date for the college is, if you submit today, we're going to use that as the date to determine, did you meet the criteria? Did you meet the 12 months? Do we have the evidence? We don't do future date. We get students saying, well, we moved here 4 months ago, but next year I'll be in. Well, no, you've got to come back next year. We got to see if, you know, you took the actions and that's it. So we use the effective date. Typically, there's an expiration for new enrollments. 15 months was come up with as a reasonable, that if a student applies in their high school senior year, and maybe they don't go that fall, but they defer for a semester to spring, it should still be valid. But, you know, we want to do, it's something that's not meant to be permanent, because there are families that, for example, move out of state after the student graduates high school. So, as long as they're continuously enrolled, most students are fine. If they break that or go somewhere else, they need an active determination. And I'm going to talk about some of the extensions in a minute. If the student has a change, let's say they appeal it, and they come through an appeal, let's say 2 months later, it's institutional policy. Once we give the effective date as the day they submit. So if the student submits it late in the term, it's your policy that determines the effective term. I think most institutions, most community colleges, I think, are allowing them to do it as long as it presented the same term. Okay. UNCs have a uniform policy. They'll only go to a certain point. I think it's 45 days from start of term, and after that, they have to wait. So that's institutional policy. We simply pass on the effective date. Some of the enhancements we've made is we continue to refine what's validated electronically. And this happens automatically behind the scenes. That, for example, if someone says, yeah, I have a driver's license, I've been registered to vote here, I have a vehicle, I'm employed, I pay state taxes. I mean, they're probably done with the interview at that point, because looks like we have enough. And those, we get an electronic scorecard back of saying, not seeing the detailed documents, but saying, yes, they have a license. Yes, either it's recent or they've had it at least a year, or yes, they have a vehicle registration, or yes, they filed taxes. And then importantly, it tells us, did they file claiming to be a resident, or did they file saying have employment from North Carolina, but I'm a non-resident? So we get basically a lot of that happens automatically. So the initial considerations, I'd say 88% pass behind the scenes with all of that. You know, there's flags and cross checks, but a lot of that happens automatically. I mentioned before that, you know, typically only about 5% of students are asked by us for a document. We keep trying to fine tune the language there, and I'm going to talk about guidebook changes I'm making, because people are saying, well, the language could be clearer. It's hard to get everyone to agree on language, but we have made some fine tuning to that. And then we continue to monitor what's going on. I'm going to talk about some of the changes we've implemented or implementing now due to some legal changes. So we keep abreast of that to, you know, make sure anybody that's qualified is able to get through. One of the enhancements we've done, if you're not aware, started a couple of years ago, is that most students who are enrolled have an expiration date. It keeps automatically extended twice a year for another year if they're enrolled anywhere in the state. We do this through clearinghouse data. Where that's really helped is that students then, let's say they finish 2 years university, they make a decent enroll, but they want to transfer, or at a community college, they want to transfer to university, but there's no active determination they have to come through again. Or the student who maybe has been attending 2 or 3 years at a 4-year, and they want to come home and take a class they're missing at a community college for the summer, but there was no active determination. So this has really helped. It's the majority of students. The only ones we don't do that is if they have a tuition exception, or they have a time-limited immigration status. Those won't be automatic. We have to look at, do they still meet the requirements? One of the biggest problems we had with students calling in the call center had nothing to do with determination, but I forgot my login and password. We have created even more options to help them retrieve them without having to call in. And since then, and plus the enrollment extensions, I mean, the number of calls and the number of students having to return to RDS for new determination is significantly decreased. That was the number one issue they called in about. I don't remember my password or login. If you're not aware, there's a lot of tools on the website you can direct students to, resources, a lot of 1- and 2-page flyers for students, parents, advisors to help them, especially if they're in a unique situation. A lot of them have been translated into Spanish. We keep increasing those tools on there. And again, just to let you know, the ongoing process, I'm going to talk about in a minute, the release of the new guidebook here and some of the changes. I mean, we do try to keep up with any changes and any thing we can do to enhance and improve. So the student comes through the system, they get out of state. What are the options? There are several. Again, that's a frequent call saying the student says they don't know what to do. Well, it walks them through to the screen. They can pick up the phone and call the call center. It will walk them through the difference between a reconsideration and appeal. Reconsideration is I have more information I could share, or something's changed, or an appeal is I don't have anything else to share. I just think it's wrong. And in both those cases, they can give a statement of what the situation is with them or what the circumstance is, and that helps us to do that. If they're not going to qualify because the law doesn't permit them to, then it's possible in some cases for a campus-based tuition could be considered. And finally, there's a final level of appeal that could come to us here at SCAA. We get very few of those. We probably hear in a year less than under the old system. There was a statewide committee that reviewed them. Probably what they heard in a month, but they reversed a lot. But we're finding RDS has been pretty accurate with these. But the two top reasons for those appeals, I mean, most of those students, it's rare we get one that's going to a community college. Most of them are 4 years who have been here for a year and they want to get in state simply because they've been here for a year, but they don't have any income kind of thing. And then you get some that disagree with the requirement for an immigration status. I mean, there's not much we can do with those, but there's a final level of appeal. They can come in and that goes through a very intense review just to make sure RDS did not make a mistake. So I did an analysis. These are rank ordered. A couple of years ago, we find it's still the same. What are the top reasons a student gets out on their initial consideration? Look at the number one. This just drives us nuts because there are so many students that key in their wrong social or date of birth for themselves and or parents. So the information doesn't validate with a state agency. We asked them to enter it twice carefully. So they had to have entered it identically twice incorrectly. It's a huge issue. I just don't know what we can do about that. Skipping too many questions. A lot of them just, okay, I gave you my name and address, that's enough. And they just say no to everything. So we have to take that at face value. Maybe they just moved here and didn't change any documents. Keying in other incorrect information. Younger students, again, high school, they're not financially independent. They get a warning if it says it doesn't look like you're going to pass on your own merit. You're probably going to need to provide parent information. Otherwise, you'll be out of state. Do you want to provide it? And a lot of them say no. We find out later in appeals, sometimes students do that because they can provide the information. It's the same thing with FAFSA. They have the same issue filling out FAFSA with parent information. They're thinking if they could qualify, they might get more financial aid because they don't have the income their parents do. So anyway, those top four represent, I would say, 80% of the reconsiderations we get. And had that information been correct or provided, they would have passed the first time. Followed next by these living here less than 12 months. There's not much we can do. Sorry?
I said the sad part, most of this has to do with them being teenagers. So I think if you can figure out how to get them to understand their Social Security number, they'll be okay.
Right. And when I'm trying to do more statewide training for counselors, high school counselors and whatnot, I'm really emphasizing these points because I mean, and then we get the angry, I've been here my whole life. How dare you say I'm out of state? You're wrong, you know, whatever. Um, we have to take at face value what they put in. Okay, here's your social. Well, we can't find a record of that person. So the other ones there would be next in order. I mean, people will argue about having to be here 12 months. My family just moved here. It's not my fault. Well, or they don't hold an eligible immigration status. Not much we can do about that. But these are the top reasons. It's rare there's anything else. Sometimes I hear pushback of saying, oh, because the students aren't passing because they have special circumstances. It is so rare for me to see that in an appeal, that it was an unusual situation with the family or something. It's almost always one of these. So some tips, you know, to suggest working with students is be very careful, especially identify. Don't guess. A lot of them just make up things. You make up an address, you make up a social, you make a date of birth, you make up saying, you know, here's my driver's license number. It's going to get bounced. It just is. They can always say where they are and come back. They can always contact the call center, who can get in there and see what screen they're on and give them some guidance, you know, or they could email, you know, if they have questions. Because I say, I didn't know how to fill it out or whatnot. I keep emphasizing to them again, please don't complete this part of their fall of their senior year. So if you have CCP students, they're going to need this when they go to curriculum program. But if you complete it too early, it's going to expire before they enroll. They'll have to cut through again. Generally, a student won't be able to qualify as independent prior to 19. So we have, and again, it's a different population, but keep in mind RDS serves the UNCs, the private and independents, and a lot of people from out of state. I'd say about 12, 14% of our students applying live out of state, and they're trying to come here to go to school. So it's not unusual. The UNCs know this well, that if they figure out they're trying to target, especially one of the more competitive UNCs, they'll have the student come here for their last year of high school, living with a family, a distant relative or something. And say, well, I've been here, you know, I moved here at 17, I don't live with my parents, so I'm independent. Generally, if you can't gain your legal ability to start establishing a residence till your 18th birthday, you're going to have to do that if you can truly meet all the criteria, and then wait the year till you're 19. If they can provide a statement, if they come back for a reconsideration appeal, if they have, quote, special circumstances, even though the interview, I think, screens for just about anything I could think of, then, you know, put that statement. It's helpful to know what to look for. Like, for example, we've had students say, my parents incarcerated. Okay, if we know that, we could do database lookups, and as long as they're in North Carolina, student's good to go. You know, so if we know what we're looking for, that's very helpful. And when the process finishes, the determination goes immediately. It's real time to a server that your colleges pull from, and at the same time to the grants portal. So what then the roles of the campus is, you set up a process to pull these in. They can be pulled in batches or individually for new students. Your IT will set up an automated process. Most people do it once overnight. Some colleges, some of the larger ones, I understand, do it more frequently to pull them in a batch. But as you know, those of you who've been around, XRDO is probably emblazed in your brains about you can one-on-one pull up a student's determination and pull it in, especially if it's a recent or new one. Campus is not required to collect all the documentation of stuff that we do on determinations we certified. Only if you're giving a campus-based exception and it requires certain things to be documented, or you have another reason, such as veterans exception we're going to get to. Okay, the VA has very strict auditing processes and want to see documentation of everything. Okay, if it's required for that, yes, you need a copy of that. But for our purposes, we're the ones that would be on the hook legally if there's, you know, a question. And a lot of ours is electronic, but you know, there's really no need for you to do that unless there's another purpose in terms of anything RDS determines that isn't an exception that you're in. And then any campus-based tuition exceptions. We're going to get to those. They're campus-based because there are other requirements that we can't ensure. And so those you would need to document and track ongoing eligibility and any time-limited scenarios. We'll get into more details than that in the other presentation. But for example, if they have a time-limited visa and it expires in 18 months, we will pass on a flag that says this is an non-immigrant visa that needs tracking, and here's the date that it expires. So most campuses should probably review those once or twice a year, run a report, run a query, and if the student is going to expire, they need to show evidence it's been renewed. You could either send them back to RDS, or there's a way you could document that. And again, we'll go through that in detail next time. There's possibilities of a grace period if someone had in determination. They tell you the family's moved away, but they want to continue to be enrolled in, let's say, online classes. There's a way to coordinate with RDS. They may be able to keep that for 12 months. So those are the responsibilities of the campus. As I say, we'll go into far more detail next time. So let's talk about some changes and updates. I've been wanting to release a new edition of the RDS guidebook, not that there's extensive changes, but I've been holding off because this legislative session has just moved very slowly in terms of looking at any bills out there. There were several, as happens pretty much every session, a lot of proposals. They have not advanced at all, and it looks like at this point, you know, if they finish up some other things, I mean, the big chore is the budget, and that's going to be it for this year. But I didn't want to release something and have them change it. Also, it's not uncommon that they will take a separate bill and edit it into the text of the appropriations budget. So I've just been very cautious, but I'm pretty sure now we are where we're going to be. So there's a new one coming out. So it will be released early in the next week or so, and you all will receive copies on it through listserv. And closely followed by the campus residency responsibility guide. Need to make the adjustments to reflect the changes in the guidebook. So I'm finishing that up. In addition to a couple of changes I'm going to talk about here, some questions have come up in the past, including on these calls, and they've come up frequently enough that I'm, amending the language to provide a little more clarification about a couple of situations. So those will be forthcoming. But a quick overview of the changes are, I'm adding 3 new, well, they're kind of new subtypes of existing E&L visas that would be eligible. And again, we screen for these, but just FYI, I spend a lot of time on immigration issues trying to make sure we have the most current eligibility in place. Continue to get so many questions about, quote, this is why I don't like popular terms of, quote, undocumented or, quote, refugees, about things like humanitarian parole. All these refugees, quote unquote, from Afghanistan and Ukraine, they were not classified as refugees by immigration. We have to go by how they do it, but they were given a humanitarian parole. So that's not a status. It's basically saying you could stay here temporarily for 2 years and either apply for another status, go somewhere else, or figure something else out. Okay. So it does not confer a status. They may not establish a residence. So that's one example of several conditions where it doesn't grant a status. There's other types of parole. There's some for juveniles. There's a withholding from removal. There's the DACA. These all are the same in the sense that legally they can be here temporarily until such time a decision is made. Okay. But they don't have a status to allow them to establish a residence. So they can have an abode, be here present physically. This really isn't a change, but with some changes coming up involving potential programs in correctional institutions, just to clarify that we've traditionally looked at if you were a North Carolina resident when you went in, especially into a North Carolina facility, you're a North Carolina resident. Okay. If you're in a federal, it gets trickier because they often move in between states, but RDS is simply to clarify, we're going to look at where were you a resident at the time of incarceration. So you're not going to lose your residency nor is it likely you're going to be able to change it while you're incarcerated. So just because a particular scenario came up of someone who was incarcerated in North Carolina, but they were passing through and never lived here. So that would be a rare instance of we'd probably not be able to approve them. There's also a new tuition exception in federal law, and this is actually part of the section that talks about active duty military. Now, this is going to cause confusion, but let me just tell you, this is going to be rare. I don't even know that there is a single person in the state that would qualify. If you're a member of the U.S. Foreign Service and you are stationed here, there are some that, for example, are stationed in D.C. and Virginia. There's one small office in Atlanta, I think, are the nearest, but these are people that will be sent overseas, for example, to work in a U.S. consulate or, for an ambassador or something like that. It is not all U.S. workers, okay, federal employees. So it's very limited. But, if we come across any, they have the option. So we're aware of it and building that into the interview. So those are the primary changes. Some clarifying language additionally is the language that's been in place in our guidebook since the 80s talks about that active duty military and their eligible family members. It doesn't specifically say spouse, and that's become a big concern of some people. So we are putting that term in specifically because the law does apply to them, and we've always granted it to them since that provision was passed back in 84, 85, whatever it was. So just providing clarifying language. Yes, they're fine. Okay, am I back now? Hello, hello?
Yes, you're back, Gene.
Okay, sorry, don't know what happened. Let me see if we can pick up where we were. Sorry, y'all, hold on one second. I'm trying to pull this up again. Yes, I think it is aliens. Okay. All right. So that's an overview of changes coming in. You can see this now. Announcements. Okay, here we go. All right, so that and finally, the other clarifying language, because this has come up in a couple calls in the past, is language in the guidebook about students who there's language, if they have that active duty military exception stationed in North Carolina, if the service member gets transferred, they can keep it as long as they're continuously enrolled. There's language in there, what happens if the service member retires or is honorably discharged, and it talks about presenting evidence of residency, whatnot. Again, I've provided some clarifying language. The bottom line is those apply to keeping the exception at the college that's already in place. You cannot ever change their residency status. You can't make them a resident. So that's allowing them, if they show they have remained in North Carolina, that student can keep the exception, not just the service member transferring it. Anyway, there's more detail in there. If you have questions, we can look at it. But always, if a student's looking to change from an exception to get an in-state residency, that has to return. It gives them the opportunity to continue the exception, and you could either handle that at your end or work with RDS. So it just gives additional options to keep that tuition exception. Everyone would still have to meet the regular criteria for residency, including the duration. So if they've been claiming another state, as many of them will do, and they are discharged or retire, let's say today, that clock's going to start with the 12 months in terms of started, established a domicile in North Carolina and continued it, but they can keep the exception in the meantime. So if there's questions about that, happy to look at them one-on-one with you, but I've tried to provide more clarifying information. So that's it for updates. And then those who can't meet the requirements, they've gone through the appeals, they've done whatever, they don't have an immigration status, they haven't been here 12 months, or, what are the options? Well, you have campus-based tuition exceptions. And I'm just going to quickly go through these because I say that's the subject of a whole nother, because each one is clearly defined in law about what's involved. They're listed in the RDS guidebook. The one that is universal, these are basically sector specific. You all have quite a number in the community college system. UNC only has 2. That's all they're interested in. But there's more options here, but they all have rules and regs attached to them and often time frames. The one that's universal for everyone is the VA exception, and I'm going to talk about that for non-resident students, and then we'll come back to the list of the others, an overview. So if all else fails, but it's always better to see if they meet the residency requirements, even if they have like a VA benefit or they are active duty, because then you might be opening up grants, and then you don't have to track these and worried about ongoing eligibility. So veterans, it can apply to the veteran and eligible dependents. It has to be handled as a campus because these require ongoing eligibility and use each term of a VA benefit, tuition benefit, in order to qualify for a tuition rate change. So we'll screen first to see if they meet the regular criteria. There is no blanket, just because you're a veteran, and here physically, that you're going to get a benefit or a tuition exception. No, it's not like the active duty where you just have to be stationed here and it's done. You don't have any other criteria. These are governed by federal law, and so we have to follow their eligibility. The easiest thing to keep in mind here is, did the VA award them? If they have an award, you give them the adjustment. If they didn't, or the family member doesn't have one, or they've used it up, or they don't want to use it, they don't get a tuition exception. They have to be receiving that. So they're also supposed to sign a document saying their intent is they're in the process of establishing residency here. So in theory, these shouldn't go on for years. Okay. But we've had people that, for example, say, I don't want to use my benefit. I want to save it. We had someone about 3-4 years ago that was just discharged from the military, had no history in the state, wanted to go to college, and was angry they couldn't get this because they didn't want to use it. They said, I want to save it to later in my career when, they're going to start a community college, so where it would be, benefit, because they're time limited. and was angry, went to governor, everything else. But the VA, it's the federal VA's benefits and their rules. There is no provision if you're not using it. Likewise, we have family members get upset saying the veteran didn't assign the benefit to me. They have to. Not much we could do. But again, these are VA rules and not ours. Again, I can't stress that enough. It's the VA award. You know, I get questions about, well, can't we do anything? Can't we do anything? Well, no, I mean, they need to establish residency like anyone else. They have the benefit, they can use it. If they're choosing not to, that's their choice. If they tell us they have a benefit and they're a non-resident, we flag it with a code. It's informational that says VetX. We don't know if they have, we don't know if they've used it. They're just telling us, and we pass it on FYI. So getting to the community college campus-based exceptions, each one of these have very specific requirements in law, and that campus residency responsibility guide, for those of you who deal with these and would grant them, we'll walk through that next time, but just quick overview. Business sponsors, this is where you have a North Carolina employer who technically is saying they're sending the employee for training. If they pay 100% directly to the college, the student hasn't met the criteria for residency, you can adjust the tuition to in-state for that semester. Business and military transferred, I wouldn't use this for active duty military because there's a separate provision. These might be used for civilian. These are people who were working for an employer already in another state and they transferred them here. And they have moved here and plan to stay, but they don't meet that 12-month duration. But this one has a strict cap in the community college system code about you can't exceed 1% of your out-of-state enrollment. So for smaller colleges, that may mean 1 or 2 students a semester. This third one, there's a lot of misunderstanding about students sponsored by a nonprofit. They try to apply this to, by the way, the business and sponsored, the first one, is really the only one that you all have direct access to that might be applied to someone truly with no immigration status or history, like a DACA student. It doesn't require that. Sponsored by non-profit entity, people have tried to use this for those cases. It still requires the student has the ability and they've started to establish a domicile, but most of these are meant to help with duration, but don't meet duration yet. That would be one. The next one, there's a lot of misunderstanding this again about the term refugee, because it's one of the ones misused popularly. They have to have been classified by U.S. Immigration as rented refugee, not applied, refugee status, but they haven't held it for 12 months yet to meet the duration. Refugees eligible for our purposes, but whether you're a citizen or non-citizen, you have to be here 12 months. So that's a narrow window you might be able to use that in if that's, you know, as soon as they arrive, they're seeking to enroll. Certain non-US citizen public high school, it's got to be a public high school. This gets very tricky because this is a frequent call I have from a lot of you all about, because it has to be that they were lawfully admitted at some point. And so figuring that out, they might have a current status, they might not have one any longer, but is not an easy feat. It's convoluted. I'd say give a call if you need help or guidance. Whoops, in figuring that out. Sorry, y'all. I don't know what happened. Okay. We're almost done, by the way. Thank you for hanging in there. So, and then finally, we have, second here. A non-citizen who has a pending application for a green card. Again, we will take an application once it's been approved. A lot of times there's a delay of months and months before they get their physical green card. This is saying if they just apply. That's a community college possibility, but you need to know, again, what documents to look for and all that. I can help with that if you need help. Law enforcement officers, I think it's real detailed. I'm not going to go into. And then certain U.S. citizen public high school graduates. Again, it goes back into the This has very specific rules. It's good only for 12 months from the date of their high school graduation, period. So that's a possibility. So again, if you're interested in those, look at the campus responsibility guide. It goes through more detail of what the legal requirements are to grant them and how you would do that. And we'll go through that in more detail in the next session. And then finally, there's one that is a UNC system exception. They only have two. The other one is if they're 100% full scholarship by the institution, is good at that institution. But this one, the UNC system has said they will recognize if they're eligible full-time employee and their family. They have to have established a residence, so they have to be eligible citizen or eligible non-citizen in North Carolina. They just don't have the duration yet, but it has to be an eligible full-time position. We get a lot of questions about, some people have given it to students, to people that like work in like a UNC community medical. That's not eligible. It's got to be one of the UNC campuses, or there's a couple specifically designated in their law teaching hospitals. So we would have to follow their requirements set in law if we grant this one. Okay. Don't get those very often because they also have some free tuition provisions. So I think it's rare. But if you get these weird ones that are, I should say, uncommon, it's probably best let's walk through it together. And again, these all have responsibilities for tracking and how to document. In these cases, you would document if you're making an exception locally. So the official publications, if you're not aware, the RDS Guidebook's a public document. It's on our public website. You'll be receiving a copy. The other one's internal use of how to track students, or some more detail, or understanding the codes, other types of roles, and understanding expiration dates and so forth. If you're not aware, and this is also in that campus guide, there's a public website. There's a lot of information to help students, counselors, parents on there. The RDS Guidebook's there. They can always call that student helpline. They could ask, they could fill out, including verbally, a third-party release. They could talk to an advisor or someone with details. They can email. For campus staff only, please, we have a separate line that goes directly to our operational staff that processes like all the appeals and whatnot, who get into more of the detailed general troubleshooting, trying to understand general questions about it, the status of the determination, and so forth. That would probably be your best bet. And then my contact information, if it's anything pertaining to interpretation of laws, policies, if it's a campus-based exception, they really don't understand them at RDS because they don't deal with that. So probably, send it my way first. If I can't answer it, send it to someone else. And then the official publications. And then finally, the next training is going to be, again, you'll get copies of this, that will do a deeper dive next month into those specific things, how to handle the exceptions, who requires tracking, responsibilities, understanding codes, troubleshooting, and so forth, working with the interface with colleague. So that's it. So I wanted to make sure we had time to take questions.
Do we have any questions, everyone? Anyone?
I do. I have a question. This is Reba Smith. I have
Yes.
questions about, hi. I have a question about, we have a student that was incarcerated and he was in a North Carolina facility. And when he completed residency yesterday, it put him as out of state. So should he do an appeal so that he can give details of where he was and the reasoning why he doesn't have the information that is needed?
Probably. I think if the student, if they did reconsideration, we try to work with it, but the appeal might be a little better. But what's critical is the student needs to tell us that, because if we can look it up, once they're released, we just simply look for a way to, we look at when were they released, and especially if it's recent, that's easier to handle. But if it was like 5 years ago, we need something to show they really haven't left the state. They haven't broken residency. So we'll work with them. Sometimes if they don't have it, if they have a new ID card, or if they're working, sometimes we can look that up in databases. We'll work with them one-on-one, but yeah, that's fine. Just have them explain the situation. And I mean, there have been times when it was a recent release that we've gotten a letter from corrections or parole officer saying, yes, they were released, and yes, they are here in North Carolina. You know, they're reporting to me if they don't have any other documents. A lot depends on how long they were incarcerated. Sometimes we can still find stuff online. If it was long-term, it gets a little trickier. We'll use stuff like that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Jean, this
Hey.
is Sandy Wagner with Isothermal.
Yes, hi.
I have a student situation that I was discussing with a colleague. The student is from North Carolina, moved out of state for about a year and a half, and is now back in state.
Mhm.
And during that conversation, there was reference about the 5-year rule, and I'm not sure if that was referenced to me correctly, but they shared that the student would then have to be back in state for 5 years to receive residency. My interpretation is the student needs to be back in state for 1 year as they've established themselves. Can you help me understand that?
Sure. I'm going to say it depends. At the time that the student left, were they independent here on their own merit? Was the family here? Are they still dependent? Because that would make a difference. There's also a provision in law if someone was considered a resident, then they move out of state, maybe even change their documents, but change their mind saying, hey, it didn't work out. I went to Hollywood. I really didn't get discovered. So 9 months later, they moved back. There's a provision where as long as they start making changes back, they wouldn't have to meet the 12 months. But I think there's a lot of variables here about were they dependent on parents even during their absence that we might still link them here, or if it was an older student, what was the length of time? What were the circumstances? 5-year really primarily, there's a lot of misunderstanding about, but primarily applies to minors who don't live with their parents and haven't long-term. So these aren't the people that come here their last year of high school trying to live with a cousin to try to qualify for admission. This is someone who's lived with their grandmother since they were 7, kind of thing. But if again, a lot's going to depend on would we have considered the student independent and then they left and came back, it might be a year duration, but if not, and they're still dependent on someone here, there may be a way, but there's where the appeal is going to have to look at those variables with the student.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to take a look if you want, but you know, you can email me or something, but yeah, those are the types of things where these are the ones, but I mean, you're talking about these are the 1% or less that do have unusual circumstances, but there's so many variables. We might be able to qualify in one way, we might another way, but it depends on those variables in that case.
Sure. Sure. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hey, Gene, Philip Lopp, Rowan Cabarrus Community College.
Yes.
How you doing today, sir?
Okay, how are you? Haven't talked to you in a while.
Huh?
Haven't talked to you in a while.
Yes, doing well, doing well. Just have a quick question. I think you covered it in this, but my financial aid office and I were in a discussion about, so we have the in-state, a couple of the in-state qualified veterans, and some of them do not, they don't get their residency after a year, or, you know, we try to push them to do it.
Right.
There is no time limit. I think is what you were saying. We can just use that, but still try to push them towards doing the residency.
Well, personally, I would from my perspective, because I'm saying if they're saying that they are willing to and that they're planning to and working on establishing it, I would encourage them to do that. I mean, again, it could open up state grants, but ultimately, the VA calls the shots on this one. They require that they sign that statement of, I'm in the process of establishing domicile.
Okay.
So I would ask for them for guidance about, I mean, I doubt they're going to say, okay, we're not going to award them at some point, but that's their call. It's not ours. Yeah, they govern all of that. So you might bring that up and say, hey, what do we do for the person who's here long-term and doesn't appear to be making any movement toward that.
Okay.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, if they award it, you have to do the adjustment, done. But I mean, it raises the question, but they do have that requirement that they're supposed to be doing that.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. I didn't know they had that on their end. So.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Hey, Jean, I have a question. This is Sherelle from Nash.
Uh-huh.
I have a student that has an exemption code because he's a ward of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And when he did his residency, they marked him out of state. And then when he did his reconsideration, they still marked him out of state. The business office said he would have to be an in-state student for us to waive his tuition based on his ward of state exemption. What's your recommendation for this young man? I looked at his documents that he submitted, and his documents were dated back from 2021, so I'm not sure how to proceed.
So this has come up a couple times recently. We had one that was from one of the universities. There's several considerations of ward of state. The key is, from our perspective, let's leave the tuition and the financial piece out of it for a minute, because they could be eligible for, tuition waivers. Is were they awarded the state when they turned 18, or if they're in high school now, are they currently? We've had students present information saying, a letter saying, oh, I was awarded the state. Yeah, but they were adopted at age 6. So they haven't been awarded. They have adopted parents. They have legal parents. That's who we have to go with. And that's what happened in this case. However, the complication is that from the financial side, depending on the age they're adopted, if they're adopted at a later age, and I don't remember exactly what it is, age 16, I'd have to contact the folks in those offices at the state level, but they could still get the benefit provided they're here. So it's if you want to send me an email or call me, I'll look at it with you. Is in this case, the student didn't pass because they were adopted years ago. Or is it the student never gave us the document? Sometimes they won't give the document and they never reply, so we have to default them to out. So there's a lot of variables there, but even if they don't meet the criteria in terms of, let's say they were adopted at age 12, well, let's say 15 or something. So they have legal parents, but they might still have that benefit. You'd have to work with the state office of certifying the benefit, and we'd have to figure out, I guess, work with the system office how to do something about the, although the code may override it, and Monty and can work with Sonia or somebody to figure that out. But it's possible that legally they were not awarded the state anymore, but could still get a benefit.
Okay.
So if you want to send me that, I can take a look, see if I can figure out what's going on.
Yes, thank you.
Sherelle, Brian said, keep in mind that even if a student qualifies for the waiver, all financial aid must be applied first and only remaining tuition, sorry, if any can be waived. And Sherelle said, Sonia said she'll email you also.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
She emailed you. Also, there's a question, Gene. Would an RDS person be willing to be on a call on a video session for a group of high school students completing the RDS in an evening workshop?
I would say I really don't have the resources. We have those CFNC reps who reach out to every school and offer that. And we have upcoming CFNC has a number of, I'm trying to do it only if it's a large state level group, okay? Because I just don't have the time, with all the other, but we have those CFNC regional reps throughout the state, including a couple that are Spanish speaking, that will go into specific schools. We also offer through CFNC, actually I'm doing one, of them for all of the high school counselors around the state. There's other ones for parents, and they provide those. So really, I think there's a lot more of them than me. Okay. So I would suggest doing that. But yeah, there's a lot of CFNC activity designed for parents and high school advisors and counselors. I'm happy to for your staff or things like that, but I just don't have bandwidth, as they say, to start getting into all the schools around the state.
Well, Trina said she's been on a call with the CFNC reps with parents, and it's very helpful. So that may be an option.
Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, feedback?
I think you'll get more questions with the next session. The campus responsibilities, that's where a lot of the questions come from.
Gene, I have one more. This is Philip again.
Sure, Philip.
And this is more to maybe let everybody else kind of know this, but so we had a student that came here. He's from South Carolina. And he and his mother were under the assumption that because South Carolina did not have the program that he wanted, the degree that he wanted, and we did, that they could get in-state tuition here. Have you heard of that?
Nope.
Okay, I
Yeah,
found
yeah.
I did find something, and there is a reciprocity with South Carolina and about 12 other states in the Southeast, but we are not one of them. But that's the third time it's happened to me, so I just wanted to make sure what I found was correct.
Once upon a time, I know there were individual institutions that had that for one or two programs, where you're talking about 4 years, if my recollection, but I think that's gone as well. And in fairness, I will say that we have the reverse happen where somebody's gone to South Carolina and they're like, well, how come I can't get in-state tuition? Or I only live, 20 miles from the border, and unlikely, but we see a lot of that, especially around the borders, of students trying to take classes here. What folks often don't realize is how low our tuition rates are compared to most of the country. We're some of the lowest in the country, especially this. If you're an in-state resident in South Carolina and you want to go to the community college there, Rock Hill, your in-state rate is almost what our out-of-state rate is. And the same thing, Virginia is not quite that much, but almost. Yeah. I mean, this is how low they are compared to others. So a lot of people, when they figure that out, are truly trying to find ways. But no, I've not heard anything. I mean, there's nothing to stop, I guess, a foundation or somebody from scholarshiping or giving the difference. But, there's no provision I'm aware of.
I have a question. This is Jessie at South Piedmont.
Uh-huh.
Hi. You mentioned keeping an eye on those folks that come in that have like time limited visas, and I'm guessing that would show in XRDS in the track flag date. Do other schools, do you run an informer report that just catches all those that have dates in that field, or what's the best way for us to kind of run the report to keep an eye on those students? Or identify those students that have the time limited that need to be sent back to RDS?
I'll share that's my impression from a couple schools, but maybe some of them. Yes, it will get flagged. There's a particular flag, and then we pass on the expiration date, so you would see it. So I mean, I think you need to, this is like once a year, twice a year. It's not like you have to do that every week.
And usually, so what we do here is we'll put a perk on the student's account for that date. So,
how do you identify those students? Because is there a report that you run, or do you just?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an informer report.
Informer. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and we'll go into this in more detail next session, Jesse, if you want, but like,
Okay.
since we flag it with a particular flag, NIMMT, non-immigrant tract, you could, use that and pull up students with that and their expiration date.
Okay.
I don't think you're gonna have a large number.
Mhm.
Because most of your students coming through are probably green card holders that don't expire or asylee or refugee that don't expire, so.
Okay. Okay.
And
I
Brian,
just,
incident ticket, Jesse, and he can help you with that.
okay, perfect. Thank you.
We have another question also. If a military sponsor dies, is the spouse still eligible for the MILD waiver the following semester after passing?
That's an interesting provision that isn't in there, but I would say the spirit without consulting with the attorney, I would say that the spirit of that is if they continue to be continuously enrolled, I'd handle it like you would a transfer. Same thing came up with about a divorce or something like that. It gets trickier with dependents if they marry or age out, they're no longer a dependent. They can probably continue their program, but beyond that, no, they're not gonna, be able to use that again. So, yeah, I mean, if you have one of those, then I will look at it. If necessary, I can get legal counsel. But my gut tells me I would treat it the same way as others. Let them finish their program.
Yeah. Okay, the next one is, are there exceptions for students displaced by natural disasters to or from North Carolina?
No. This has come up every time we have a natural disaster, and Puerto Rico, we saw a number of people, this and that. The legislature is not given a blanket. Now, that having been said, we would, if a student is displaced, they're a North Carolina resident, we've had this happen, home was destroyed or at least unlivable in the meantime by a hurricane. They're temporarily living with relatives in South Carolina. They're not going to lose residency. If they're saying the intent is at some point to return, it's not a permanent move, and they're not changing everything to North Carolina and claiming North Carolina on their taxes, they'd be fine. So, once you establish a domicile, the first 12 months are critical. You've got to be here. You can't just on paper establish one and never live here. But there's all kinds of provisions for absences. Someone's abroad for a year or two teaching or working. There's a lot of provisions there. So this would fall under that. We would certainly take that into consideration. And unless there was evidence they truly made a permanent change, we would grant that. But no, there's not. Thus far, the legislature's not any time in recent history given blanket exceptions for people from elsewhere coming here for the first time.
Any more questions? Great questions, though.
Also, I just want to say, I hope that things are generally going well. You're always going to have the one or two unusual situations. We're happy to try to work with you on those and find out. Sometimes a student just doesn't give full information or any information or something. If there's anything we can do, but hopefully you're finding that, if you're contacting RDS or contacting me, that you're getting, a response to try to resolve it with you. If you have any concerns about the system or something, let me know, because we do provide oversight to CFI and the RDS system.
Gene, I did want to ask something real quick. We've had a couple of super Saturdays, and it seems like Saturdays, it takes forever to get that return email when we send the XRDO. Is that generally going to be the case? Or, I mean, sometimes it takes 20, 30 minutes on Saturdays to get that.
I'd start with your IT. Those emails are not generated in any way. They never touch our system. All that does is when you run XRDO, it triggers a process in your server to reach out to the Cross Connect server and pull in a determination. I'm not aware of any delays at our end. I don't know if there's something, in terms of traffic or how it's set up or what. I don't know whether it's volume. A lot of times I know local ITs will run a lot of maintenance processes nights or weekends because people generally aren't there. So you might have a conversation at your level.
Okay. All right.
Rhonda Reed says our IT adjusts the runtime for special days on the weekends, Philip. And also Brian says put in an incident ticket. Anything else? Any more questions? All right, Gene, thank you. This is always wonderful to have you come talk to us and stuff on this.
Hope that's helpful. If you have a couple, you ask me individual scenarios or something, if you want to take a look, if you just shoot me an email.
And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to stop recording right now because I know some people don't want to ask questions with it being recording.
Okay.
And stuff, kind of shy on that. So I'm stopping recording right now.